Governor Huckabee, thank you so much for joining me on this interview here for All Israel News.
Thank you, Joel. It's a pleasure to be with you. Congratulations on your new book. And I'm excited about being able to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that's Israel and the role that it plays in the world and the relationship that it has with the United States and with believers throughout the world.
Well, you are one of, if not perhaps the most influential and famous evangelical Christians known for your incredibly deep love for Israel. We're going to talk in a few minutes about your first trip ever coming here, when that was, when you started bringing people. I've lost track. I've heard you say you've lost track of how many people and how many trips, but we'll get into that in a few minutes, including some of your theological upbringing. Why do you love Israel theologically? There are probably other reasons also. We can talk about those. But I want to start by saying thank you for joining the advisory board of All Israel News. As we get started, I think, again, we just see so much fake news, so much bias against Israel, but also against Christians, against Jews, against Muslims in this part of the world. We just think it's important to have a site that does original reporting, exclusive interviews, polling, as well as linking to all the most interesting articles of the day in the Israeli press, Arab, and other regional press. So your advice to me personally over the years has been very appreciated. I've known you since you were on Fox, then, of course, your shift to TBN, and of course, a few presidential campaigns along the way as well. So let's start with the big news of the moment, of course, and the first Arab-Israeli peace treaty in almost 26 years. This is so huge, and of course, for everybody who's been a critic of Israel and a critic of the Trump administration, the idea that President Trump, who wrote Art of the Deal, has perhaps crafted one of the most dramatic and historic deals, certainly in a quarter of a century, is surprising to a lot of people. But I don't think it's so surprising to you. But why don't you talk about the significance of this UAE Israeli peace deal?
Well, I think it's not just the first one in 25 years. It's the biggest one since the Israeli-Egyptian Accords that were done 40 years ago. And the reason I say that is because there was a certain expectation that there was a thawing of relationships between Israel and Jordan. So when that relationship began to develop 25 years ago officially, it wasn't that big of a surprise. I mean, it was a transition, and it was very significant, no doubt about that. But what we have here is one of the major Gulf states, one of the true powerhouses in the Gulf region, officially recognizing Israel's right to exist, establishing full diplomatic relationships, opening up to travel directly, tourism, economic participation, security, partnerships. This is huge. This is absolutely astonishing. And I don't know that many people in the United States fully appreciated what a significant hurdle this is, and the fact that I believe that it will open up the doors for other major Gulf states to join in recognizing Israel. And Joel, the reason is simple. Increasingly over the last few decades, the Gulf states understood that there was no threat from Israel. Israel had no intention of rushing in and trying to take over Saudi Arabia or Qatar or the UAE. They had no interest in that. They felt there was one sliver of real estate on planet Earth that was theirs, given to them by God, and that was the piece of real estate that they were bound and determined not only to possess, but to protect. They didn't care if somebody else had the other parts of the globe. And what I think they, meaning the other Gulf states, came to realize was that the threat that they had came not from Israel. It came from Iran. And the one thing that they had in common was that the Israelis and the rest of the Arab world recognized that the true threat, not just to them, but to the world and any stabilization of the world, was from Iran. So that was sort of the opening. I want to say President Trump should be heralded for this breakthrough. And I know he had a great team in place: Ambassador Friedman, Jason Greenblatt, Jared Kushner. There were Ron Dermer, who was working for the Israeli side, and the prime minister. But all of the partners in this were very significant. But this would not have happened had the president not given the green light to his team to do something incredibly unconventional and to believe in something bigger than what had been attempted before. And I just,
yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I just wish that what I would call the establishment diplomatic community in the United States, the deep staters, if you will, could step back from their dislike personally of President Trump long enough to give him a standing ovation for this incredible breakthrough.
Well, as I understand it, in terms of tracking the media coverage of this announcement, even just in the last few weeks, it actually didn't make the primetime coverage on most of the cable networks. Got obviously some mention. It was an important moment, but it actually didn't get that much coverage.
No.
Of course, there was a saturation coverage here in Israel. I'm obviously talking to you from Jerusalem, and of course throughout the region. But now, maybe when the White House event, the ceremony happens, we understand it will be in September. We don't have an exact date yet as you and I record this. But at that moment, there perhaps will be more. But talk to me about the fact that the president's vision for peace, which was laid out earlier in this year, pre-COVID, which now seems like a million years ago, but there was so much criticism of the plan, but also the broader vision, because the plan was the plan for Israelis and Palestinians. And lots of people have had views of that. But the larger view of the president's vision was, let's present something that is a starting point for discussions again between the Israelis and Palestinians. Let's look at what might be realistic, at least from the president's perspective. But how could that also lead to peace deals throughout the region? This, of course, has been a Netanyahu strategic objective for a long time also. His view that the Palestinians are not ready for peace, at least the leaders, and therefore maybe it's better to make a deal with the other countries and then hope that warms up. But the president has not, it has sort of been laughed at and certainly snickered at on this vision for peace. But talk about it and why it's working when most people didn't think it would, or at least the beginnings of it.
Well, first of all, I think it's pretty evident that the Palestinians are not interested in any particular deal other than the annihilation of Israel. They're almost Iranian in their view. And I say that not with hyperbole, but with some level of just honesty. Let me give you an example.
Do you separate out Mahmoud Abbas from the people, or do you think it's broadly the Palestinian people that?
Well, I certainly separate, and I recognize that the leadership doesn't always maybe reflect the views of the rank and file people. But I also recognize that this anti-Israel, anti-Semitic view has been indoctrinated into the children because of the way the schools teach history and the way they teach even geography. And when I go into the old city and go to Arab shops and I'm having people with me, I love to stop and say, pick up a map of Israel from one of the Palestinian shops and tell me what you see that looks weird. And they look and they say, well, Israel's not on the map. I said, that's exactly right. Doesn't exist on the map. The word doesn't come out. Why? Because they don't believe it should be there. So it's that kind of thing where the schools teach that the only good Jew is a dead Jew. There's some really horrible things that happen in terms of the if people want to talk about systemic racism in America, let me tell you what systemic anti-Semitism looks like. It looks like how it's taught in Palestinian circles.
What's interesting is when you look at the polling, with all that, and it's true, it's sadly, tragically, from the top and through the system is being promoted on television, radio, social media, and in the schools, this anti-Israel, anti-Semitic view often, and yet there's actually still a significant percentage of Palestinians who say, I still want to live in a two-state solution. I still want to have peace with my neighbors. And I would love the $50 billion that the Gulf states have offered to create jobs and factories here, the Manama conference last year. None of that seems to be moving forward.
Well, the reason is because the leadership of the Palestinian Authority doesn't want it to move forward. No, you're right. And part of that is driven by the fact that as Palestinian people work in parts of Israel, and as businesses have opened up and given Palestinian workers the best wages they ever had, the best benefits they've ever had, in an Israeli-run neighborhood, they have running water, they have good utilities, they have parks, they have curbs and gutters. They look at the difference and they say, say what you will, but these Israelis actually treat us pretty well. So there is definitely that part of the dynamic. And it's also why I think that the Palestinian leadership pushes so hard to keep their own people from seeing the Israelis as the partners that they could be if they simply wanted to be.
Talk to me about your friendship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It goes way back. Yeah. And Netanyahu, as we just discussed, is really the architect of what he has been saying for at least a decade, is his regional strategy. Let's make peace with the Gulf states, with the other Arab states, because they seem to want to make peace. It might be challenging, but can be done. And then hopefully that'll warm up the environment that a future leadership of the Palestinian Authority might be interested too. But I want to add one point there, Governor, and that is the Prime Minister was very passionate for much of this past summer, with applying sovereignty to large sections of the biblical homeland of Judea and Samaria. And certainly he seemed encouraged by the White House to head down that road, until the White House seemed to pause him and, if not reverse, say, maybe we should look at a Gulf state deal that seems to be ready to be had, instead of applying sovereignty, what people are calling annexation. Walk me through how you see it from Netanyahu's angle, but also your own, because I know you're a supporter of both peace deals and sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, or at least sections of it.
The one hesitation that I had when I first heard about the deal was, does this mean that Israel is being asked to abandon its sovereignty over Judea and Samaria? And I posed that question directly to Ambassador Friedman, who was a guest on my television show. And I've also posed it to some of the White House officials, because that would be, for me, very troubling for us to impose that upon the Israelis, because for me, this is not a geopolitical issue. It is a biblical issue. And I think any government would be probably on some shaky ground to say, oh, this is a great political deal. But if it goes against
the Israeli-UAE peace deal.
Exactly. Or any other deal.
Right.
If it goes against recognizing the sovereign borders of Israel as given by God, then as a Bible-believing person, apart from, again, any of the geopolitical considerations, that would trouble me. However, the thing that the ambassador made very clear was that this was not a permanent stop. This was a pause, and it was a delay. It wasn't that Israel gave up anything. They did not accede to that they have the right to the land. Not at all. But they agreed that they're not going to push it or act upon it while they're in the process of developing these relationships. That gave me comfort. So it's not a matter of if, it's more a matter of when. And
so, that's fascinating, because I think there's a perception among the cynics about evangelicals and our love for Israel that we're trying to grab things that we're trying to occupy, colonize, et cetera, et cetera. And so let me clarify. Let me drill in just a little bit there for you. Do you support the Trump plan as written, the peace plan? Because there alone, it creates a sovereign state for the Palestinians, demilitarized though, but it does allow, for the first time, any American peace plan would allow for 30% of Judea and Samaria to be under sovereign Israeli territory control. And then it gives actually the Palestinians more land than they currently have by creating large tracts out in the Negev desert, near Beersheba, near Gaza, near the Egyptian border. So most Americans have not, or most people have not read the plan, but actually gives Palestinians more territory, but not all in the same places. Now, from your perspective, I believe that you believe in the grand scheme, all of Judea and Samaria has been granted to Israel for eventually. I don't know if you have a time frame biblically on when that would. But so how do you look at the Trump plan specifically, and then how this all weaves together?
Well, I think it's very clear that even if the Palestinians are given what I would call some local control over geographical regions within Israel, Israel still maintains the control of that militarily. And so it's not that they are saying we will abandon it completely and totally and allow what happened in Gaza when Israel did officially completely pull out, and places like Gush Katif were abandoned by 10,000 Israeli Jews. That was disastrous. And when Hamas came into Gaza, we saw what happened. We're not going to see that under this plan because it does not allow for that level of what I would call takeover, or it's not Palestinian sovereignty. It's Palestinian maybe local control. I don't know any other way to put it other than they will have a lot of leeway within that, but they still will be militarily overseen by Israel and not by the Palestinian
Authority. To prevent a terrorist force from coming in.
Right.
Yeah, the plan itself actually does call for a sovereign Palestinian state, but there are several elements of demilitarization, Israeli control of the airspace and things for protection. Obviously, those are controversial points among the Palestinians and even among some of these Arab states. But
sure.
But you're comfortable with the premise that the Trump plan allows for 30%, eventually when it all is said and done, 30% of Judea and Samaria to come under Israeli sovereignty.
Let's also look at the realities. If the Palestinians continue their adamant objection, their approach, if it continues to be all or nothing, will end up being nothing. So what land that they are ceded in this agreement disappears if they refuse to accept it. So I think it's a rather clever play on the part of the Trump administration to say, okay, here's the deal. And
we were all told that deal, as written, would prevent any Arab state from making peace with Israel. So how do you? I mean, you explained up front, but still, it's very interesting, right? Because the cynics have said the Trump plan has ruined any prospect for a peace deal with an Arab state, and yet we've just seen one happen.
And we're going to see more. But keep in mind that many, I actually do, and there are increasing levels of frustration on the part of Arab states with the Palestinians who can't take yes for an answer. And there are, I think, many times when the Palestinians could have had much more, could have been far more advanced economically, politically, but they're still of the mind, and I go back to the phrase, they have an all or nothing mindset. And in politics particularly, let's take away for a moment the biblical aspects, which for me is the most important, but the realities are the political realities. And one thing I've learned in my 30 plus years of politics, if you say, I want all or nothing, you're going to get nothing. It's just the way things work. And so that's what I fear will happen. And when that continues to be, Arab states who have a much bigger worldview than just the Palestinians and their grievances are going to basically say, you guys walked away and there's nothing we can do for you. We're going to move on economically, scientifically.
It's very sad because you still have millions of Palestinians who they really are struggling and suffering. And yes, as an Israeli, I'll say we have a degree of responsibility for this, but for 70 plus years, there has been an offer of various peace plans, and the leadership on the other side won't take it.
And I want to mention this one quick thing I want to add. Every time there has been any semblance of an agreement, it's never been adhered to, whether it was Oslo, that was ignored. So there's not a great history here of there having been an adherence to the agreements, which further weakens the hand of the Palestinians in all of this.
Very sad. Let's take a moment as we wrap the interview, talking about when was the first time. Let's do a lightning round. When was the first time? What year did you first go to Israel?
1973, when I was 17 years old.
Wow. Before or after the Yom Kippur War?
It was 2 months before. I was there at the end of July, 1973. Of course, we had no idea that war was on its way, and I'm sure that would have changed things. But it was a life-changing event for me to be there.
Did you come with your family or with a church group?
No, the short version of the story, I had a very close friend. We both were graduating from high school. He came from a very wealthy family. I came from a very poor family. He wanted to take a senior trip and go to the Middle East and tour. And his dad said, well, son, I'm not going to let you go. Yeah. He said, I'm not going to let you go over there by yourself. But if Mike Huckabee will go with you, because his dad trusted me more than he did his son, he said, I'll pay his way and the two of you can go. And we did. Joel, we went to Lebanon, Jordan, Syria. We went to Greece and Turkey. We went all over the Middle East. So we saw so many different countries. But when I went to Israel, something special happened. And in 1973, Israel was not a very advanced country. It was a struggling little economy, selling a few Jaffa oranges and trying to bring in some tourists. And it was having a tough go. But it wasn't what I saw physically. It wasn't anything of impressive architecture at that point. But something was going on inside of me, and I felt at home in a place I'd never been. I say it's spiritual.
What were you raised to believe theologically? You were raised an evangelical in the Southern Baptist theological tradition in Arkansas. What were you taught, and what did you come into Israel in 1973 thinking?
Well, certainly that Israel was a place God had given to the Jews. And I came from a very conservative theological background. As I say to my Jewish friends, evangelicals are people of the book. So it's very important that my Jewish friends understand that they can be Jewish and have nothing to do with Christianity. Nothing. There's no connection naturally. I cannot be a Christian with not a 100% connection to the Jewish foundation and heritage that is Christianity. So I say to them, I'm not arguing with anything you believe. I embrace it too. And if the Bible says that God gave to Abraham this piece of land, and here are the parameters of it, then because I'm a person of the book and I believe the Bible, then I accept that. And there are people this is something a lot of beyond the Americas understand. They'll say, well, not all the American Christians believe that. Right. But those American Christians are people of the more formal liturgical churches who have already abandoned the Bible as the sole authority. It's no longer sola scriptura for them. Right. It's the Bible plus culture. But for those of us who are unapologetically committed to the inerrancy and infallibility of the Word of God, we take it literally. And therefore, we embrace Israel as the place God gave to his people, the Jews. And we recognize the Jewish people have a special place in God's heart. I can argue why, but they do. And so I accept that.
You have not only personally believed this theologically and enjoyed coming here as an individual, but I think it was beginning 1981. Am I right? You began bringing tours. And do you have a ballpark number at how many tours you brought over the years?
I've lost count of how many times I've been there. I'm sure I've brought tens of thousands of people over the course of the last 40 years to Israel. And people. So
it shows a commitment not just to believe what you believe, but you're trying to educate other people generally, and Christians in particular, to see what you see.
I want them to experience it firsthand for two reasons. One, I want them to connect to the scriptures, which there's no better place to do that than Israel. There's something overwhelming about the spiritual pilgrimage to Israel. But I also want them to see firsthand what the news media will never tell them. I want them to walk the streets. I want them to absorb the culture. I want them to see the security that Israel provides for its people and the manner in which this country, as a modern country, exists, and to see and to be overwhelmed and marvel at the technological advance. And in part, Joel, it's because I see a great similarity between the pioneer days of America, when people came for freedom and religious liberty, and they risk everything in order to create the United States. I see that same kind of pioneer spirit among the Israelis, who have risked everything in order to be able to raise their families with freedom and with a sense of security. The parallels are stunning.
Very
and you just don't miss that.
Yeah. Let me ask you just one last question. I would just,
Okay.
you and I have breakfast and lunch or dinner whenever you come over, whatever we have the opportunity, and we spend time together in Nashville and New York, I think. And so I want to talk to you for much longer than this, but let me just close with this. And that is, you've raised concerns with me over the years about the difference between evangelical parents and grandparents, what they believe about Israel, how deeply, for most, not all, evangelicals, it's a deep theological, biblical love for the Jewish people generally, and therefore an opposition to anti-Semitism, but also a specific love for Israel. Even not every decision that Israel makes, or even that Netanyahu makes, but a deep love for the country. But you've also expressed concern that the parents and grandparents are having some different views than the young people. Just let's wrap up with just your thoughts about kind of what are those concerns that you have about what evangelical young people believe and think, and any brief thought about how to address that.
Well, if I were, and I'm a grandparent now. I have kids that'll be coming up in 10 years going to college, who are my grandchildren. I will do everything I can to keep them out of a college or university, including a so-called Christian college or university that does not respect and honor all of the scripture. And that includes support for Israel. They may go to one of those schools, but I'm not going to help pay for it. And here's what has happened. What's taken place in American academia is a gradual and now a rushing shift to the far left, supporting the BDS movement, supporting the more radical notions that Israel is an apartheid state. And one of the reasons that I want to take people to Israel is let them see for themselves. I don't try to indoctrinate them. I simply say, look around, look for yourself and see what you see. Go back home and tell people what you actually saw. But I worry because young people are being pressured to believe something that simply isn't true, in the same way that they're being pressured to see America as a terrible place and evil and filled with systemic racism and awful history. The same thing is happening to Israel. Let me just say this to conclude. This is not a problem of misguided education. This is a spiritual battle. I believe that with all my heart. This is a battle between good and evil. And if you can indoctrinate young people, whether it's about America or about Israel, and tell them that something that is good is really evil and something that is light is truly darkness, then you have destroyed the hope, the freedom, you've destroyed the uniqueness, and you've destroyed the biblical foundation and the spiritual foundation that both of these nations are founded upon. That is frightening to me.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate your concern and all that you're doing on this issue. All right, I'm going to give you the last word, and that is, give me in a classic Huckabee headline or a phrase or whatever, the UAE Israel peace deal. What's the headline or the phrase that sort of captures you in capturing its essence?
I would put it this way. President Donald Trump, working in his unconventional way, has brought together people who just a decade ago would be considered enemies. He has made them friends. And the only people he can't seem to bring to the table of friendship is the American news media and the people of the far left. Maybe someday he can do that too. Thank you, Governor. You always summarize it
way better than me. Obviously, you've been doing this a long time. From Jerusalem, I appreciate it. By the way, where are you? Where am I speaking to you? And you're in Florida right now?
I am. I'm in the Gulf Coast of Florida. We just dodged a bullet, and the hurricane moved west of us. That is creeping toward the shores of Louisiana and Texas. So a beautiful sunshiny day, and I'm happy to be with you today. Thank you for having me, Joel.
Well, I appreciate it. And I look forward to when our gates open again here, and we can welcome you back, and you and I can break bread together. Thank you very much.
I look forward to it. Thank you.